Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. When I was a kid, I lived in a quiet subdivision at the edge of town. There were about 20 houses, all built within a few years of each other. The streets curved instead of running straight. Lawns were trimmed short. Mailboxes were evenly spaced. Every driveway had at least one basketball hoop, some broken, some new. It was the kind of place where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. Parents felt safe letting kids ride bikes until dark. Doors were locked more out of habit than fear. 4 houses down from ours lived a man in his early 30s and his mother. Even before everything happened, he stood out. He did not work. He did not drive. He was always outside during school hours, sitting on the front steps or standing in the yard, watching the street. He never smiled. He never waved. His mother did all the visible errands. She mowed the lawn herself. She carried groceries alone. She spoke to no one unless forced by circumstance. Their house was always clean, but it felt closed off, like it did not belong to the rest of the street. I was too young to understand why adults avoided that house at first. I just knew parents told their kids to stay away from that end of the block. We followed the rule without asking questions. The older kids made up reasons: dogs, mold, a bad temper. None of it mattered. We simply learned where not to go. Everything changed one summer afternoon. Police cars filled the street. Doors slammed. Neighbors stood on their lawns pretending to do yard work while watching. The man was led out in handcuffs. He looked smaller than I expected. His head was down. His mother stood in the doorway, stiff and pale, staring straight ahead. No one cheered. No one spoke. The street felt tight, like the air had thickened. Words spread fast, even to kids. 2 boys from another part of town, both 8 years old, had been abused. The man had been arrested and charged. Adults stopped trying to shield the details. They did not soften it. They did not explain it carefully. They spoke bluntly with anger and fear mixed together. My parents sat me down and told me I was never to go near that house, even if he was gone. They told me to come straight home if I saw him anywhere. For a while, the house stayed quiet. Curtains closed. No movement. Life on the street slowly returned to its old rhythm, but something had shifted. Parents watched more closely. Kids were called in earlier. The sense of ease was gone. Months later, he came back. The warning came before his return. His mother went door to door. I did not see her at first, but I saw the effect she left behind. Neighbors stood stiff in their doorways after she left, faces tight, voices raised once the door closed. When she reached our house, my mother answered. I watched from the hallway, hidden but close enough to see everything. The woman's face was red and strained. Her posture was rigid, like she was bracing herself. She stayed longer than expected. After she left, my mother closed the door slowly and leaned against it for a moment before locking it. Her hands shook. She did not look at me right away. When she finally did, her expression was different than usual. Harder. She told me the man was coming back to live with his mother. She told me what he had been convicted of. She told me that many neighbors had made it clear he was not welcome near their children under any circumstances. She told me his mother was furious about that. From that day on, the street changed completely. The man rarely left the house, but when he did, it was impossible not to notice. He walked stiffly, always looking straight ahead. He never acknowledged anyone. Parents reacted immediately when he appeared. Kids were pulled inside without explanation. Play stopped. Bikes were dropped on lawns. The street emptied within minutes. His mother became the more visible presence. She watched from windows. She stood on the porch. She took notes on a small pad whenever someone walked past her house. Anyone passing too slowly, anyone glancing toward the yard, anyone stopping for any reason triggered a response. Police cars began appearing regularly. sometimes multiple times a day. Officers spoke with her, walked the perimeter, knocked on doors. She reported everyone. If someone walked their dog past the house, she claimed harassment. If kids rode bikes down the street, she claimed threats. If a car slowed down to park, she claimed stalking. The police knew the pattern, but they still had to respond. The sight of patrol cars became normal, red and blue lights flashing against the siding at all hours. The man started standing closer to the sidewalk. Not stepping onto it, but close enough to be seen. He would stand still, hands at his sides, staring at nothing. It felt deliberate. Parents noticed. The tension escalated. Some neighbors installed cameras. Others built higher fences. A few families moved away within the year. As a kid, I felt the fear without fully understanding it. I learned to recognize it in adults' movements. The way my mother scanned the street before letting me outside. The way she stood on the porch while I played, never sitting down, never looking away. The way neighbors communicated without words, through nods and glances, always alert. The police visits increased. Sometimes officers spoke with my parents. They asked about any interactions, any threats, any sightings. My parents answered carefully. They wanted to be honest, but they did not want attention. Everyone knew the woman was waiting for a reason to call again. The man never touched anyone again, at least not that we knew of. That was part of what made it worse. Nothing happened, yet everything felt dangerous. The threat was constant, quiet, and unresolved. There was no relief, no closure. Just the knowledge of what he had done and the reality that he was still there. One afternoon, I saw him watching a group of kids from his yard. He did not move. He did not gesture. He simply watched. An adult noticed and stepped between him and the kids. Police arrived minutes later. The woman stood on the porch pointing and shaking, clearly accusing someone. The officers left after a while. Nothing changed. Years passed like that. The street aged. Kids grew up. Some houses sold. Others stayed occupied by families who learned to live with the constant alertness. Eventually, I got older and spent less time outside. I learned more about the world, about how often people like him existed, about how rarely justice felt complete. When I finally moved away, the house was still there. The mother was older. The man was heavier, slower, still living under the same roof. The street looked normal to an outsider. Clean lawns, quiet evenings, no signs warning of what had happened. What stayed with me was not a single event, but the long stretch of unease. The way safety can vanish without noise. The way adults carry fear and pass it down without meaning to. The way a neighborhood can do everything right and still feel powerless. Nothing supernatural ever happened on that street. No dramatic ending. No final confrontation. Just years of living beside something everyone wished did not exist, knowing exactly why it mattered, and understanding that some horrors do not end. They just settle in and stay. I lived in that apartment for a little over 2 years, long enough for it to feel routine and harmless. It was a second-floor unit in a narrow complex, built in the late 80s. Beige siding, thin walls, balconies that faced each other across a shared courtyard. The building formed a shallow U-shape, and at night the lights from opposite units lined up like quiet squares floating in the dark. From my bedroom window, I could see directly into the kitchens of the building across from mine. I never thought much about that. It felt normal, like part of apartment living, the unspoken agreement that everyone minds their own business. My bedroom was small, just enough space for a bed, a dresser, and a narrow walking path between them. The window sat slightly above the head of my bed, wide and low, with a cheap aluminum frame that rattled when trucks passed on the road behind the complex. During summer, I kept it open almost every night. I liked the air moving across my face, the sound of insects, the distant noise of traffic softened by heat. I kept the curtain pulled to the side so the air could circulate. The street light outside didn't shine directly in, so the room stayed dim but not black. I slept lightly there. The building carried sound easily. Footsteps on stairs, doors closing, the dull hum of someone's television through the walls. I learned the rhythm of it. I knew when the upstairs neighbor showered. I knew when the couple next door argued, because the cabinets slammed in a particular pattern. None of it bothered me. It was predictable. That night felt the same at first. I went to bed late. The room was warm but not heavy. The air smelled faintly of cut grass from somewhere nearby. I fell asleep on my back, window open, curtain pushed aside, the glow from the opposite building faint and steady. I woke without sound. There was no noise, no sudden movement. Nothing that should have pulled me out of sleep. My eyes opened on their own, slow and alert, the way they do when something feels wrong before you understand why. My body stayed still. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, steady but strong, like it had already decided something mattered. At first, I didn't move my head. I stared at the ceiling, letting my eyes adjust. The room looked the same. The dim shapes of furniture, the edge of the window frame, the thin curtain gathered to one side. Then I shifted my eyes toward the window. Across the courtyard, in the second floor unit directly facing mine, a kitchen light was off. The room was dark, but not empty. A man stood there, close to the glass. He was framed by the rectangle of the window. Shoulders square, head tilted slightly forward. His face was visible only because of the faint ambient light from outside. His eyes reflected just enough to be seen. He was looking straight at me. There was no movement, no change in posture, no sign that he had just arrived there. It felt like he had been standing like that for some time. The stillness was what made it unbearable. People shift their weight. They glance away. They blink. He did none of that. His head was angled so precisely that I knew he could see my face. My eyes open, my body in bed. My breath caught in my throat, shallow and tight. I did not sit up. I did not pull the blanket. I stayed exactly where I was, as if movement would confirm that I was awake, that I had noticed him. The open window suddenly felt like a mistake I could not undo. My mind tried to explain it. Maybe he had looked out his window and caught movement. Maybe he hadn't meant to stare. Maybe he would turn away any second. He didn't. The longer I looked, the more details I noticed. The faint outline of cabinets behind him, the edge of a countertop. His shoulders were bare or covered by something thin. I couldn't tell. His face stayed mostly in shadow, but the shape of it was wrong somehow. Too intent, too focused. His gaze never drifted. It stayed locked on the place where I lay. The feeling in my chest changed. It wasn't shock anymore. It was something colder and sharper. Awareness without panic, like my body knew panic would make things worse. I moved slowly. I turned my head first, just enough to break eye contact. My other window was on the opposite wall, closer to the foot of the bed. Its curtain was drawn fully closed. That side of the room was darker, safer. I slid my body sideways across the mattress, inch by inch. The sheets whispered under my weight. Each sound felt amplified. I kept my movements controlled, careful not to jerk or rush. I did not look back at the window while I moved. I watched the dark curtain instead, the way the fabric folded at the bottom, the small gap where it met the wall. When I reached the other side of the bed, I rolled gently onto my side, facing away from the open window. I pulled the blanket up to my shoulder. I stayed still. I listened. The night sounds continued as if nothing had changed. Crickets. A distant car. The faint buzz of electricity somewhere in the walls. No footsteps. No sliding glass. No sound from the opposite building. The absence of noise made everything worse. It meant he hadn't moved enough to make any. I lay there for a long time. I didn't check the clock. I didn't turn my head. My eyes stayed open, fixed on the dark. Every few seconds, my body urged me to look back, to confirm whether he was still there. I resisted it. I knew that if I looked and saw him again, the control I had would break. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under. It wasn't real sleep. It was shallow, broken, full of sudden awareness. I woke repeatedly, heart racing, listening, waiting for a sound that never came. Morning arrived slowly. Light crept around the edges of the curtain. The air cooled. Birds replaced insects. When I finally sat up, my neck stiff and my mouth dry, the window across the courtyard was empty. Curtains open. Kitchen light off. Nothing out of place. I stood there longer than necessary, staring back at my own reflection in the glass, half expecting him to reappear. He didn't. I closed my window. I pulled the curtain shut. I locked it, even though it only opened a few inches and had never felt like a risk before. Over the next few days, I watched the building more closely. I paid attention to the people who came and went. I recognized him by accident one afternoon, carrying groceries up the stairs. He looked ordinary, mid-30s maybe, clean clothes, neutral expression. He didn't look at me. That made it worse. I adjusted my routines. Curtains stayed closed at night. Windows stayed shut. Lights went off earlier. I avoided the courtyard when it was dark. I never told anyone. Explaining it would have made it feel unreal, like a story instead of something that had happened in my body. Nothing else occurred after that. No repeat. No escalation. He never tried to speak to me. He never approached my door. Months passed. The intensity faded, but the memory stayed sharp, unchanged by time. When my lease ended, I moved without hesitation. On my last night there, I stood in the empty bedroom and looked at the window one final time. I understood then what had unsettled me the most. It wasn't that he had looked at me. It was that he had looked at me while I slept, long enough to know exactly where I was, how I lay, how unprotected I was. I never slept with my window open again. I never left curtains pulled aside at night. Even now, years later, I still wake sometimes with that same sudden awareness, the feeling of being seen before I know why. When it happens, I don't look around. I don't check the dark. I close my eyes and wait for it to pass, because some things do not need confirmation to be real. I grew up in that house for most of my childhood, long enough that its layout became part of how I thought about space and safety. It was a narrow building with 3 apartments stacked in a way that always felt slightly wrong, like it had been divided more for convenience than for comfort. 2 of the apartments were large enough for families. Ours was on the ground floor. Another family lived above us. The 3rd apartment was in the basement, small and low, with 1 main room, a kitchen, and a bathroom squeezed into the corners. Even though it was technically a basement, it was not buried deep. The ground sloped downward from the street, so the basement had full windows on one side. Sunlight could reach in during the day. From outside, you could see straight into it if the curtains were open. When I was young, I did not think much about who lived below us. Adults were background figures then, shapes that existed but did not need explanation. I knew that a couple lived in the basement apartment. I did not know their names. I rarely saw them. When I did, it was always brief and uncomfortable, the kind of moment that leaves a residue without giving you a reason why. They were older than I expected people in that kind of apartment to be. Later, when I was old enough to think in numbers, I would place them somewhere in their 40s. At the time, they just felt out of place. They were both very large, heavy in a way that made their movements look slow and effortful. Their skin always looked pale, as if it had not seen much daylight. Their hair was unkempt. Their clothes hung loosely, worn thin in places, stretched tight in others. They never looked clean, but not dirty either, more like untouched. They did not greet anyone. They did not nod or smile. They did not make eye contact. If they passed you in the narrow hallway by the front door, they would keep their heads down and move quickly, shoulders rounded inward, as if trying to take up less space while still filling all of it. Their presence made the hallway feel smaller. I remember holding my breath without knowing why. What stood out most was how little they seemed to exist outside their apartment. We lived in a busy part of the city. People came and went all day. You could hear cars, footsteps, voices, doors opening and closing. Most neighbors were part of that rhythm. These two were not. I never saw them carrying groceries. I never saw them sitting outside, smoking or talking. I never saw friends visit. Their windows were usually covered, even during the day. At night, a dim yellow light sometimes leaked through the curtains, flat and unmoving. As a child, I tried to explain this absence to myself in simple ways. Maybe they worked at night. Maybe they were sick. Maybe they were shy. None of those ideas settled right, but I did not push them. Children are good at letting unease exist without naming it. My older sister noticed them too. She was old enough to sense danger in ways I could not articulate yet. She never said anything directly, but I could tell by how she walked faster past the basement door, how she always locked the front door behind us without pause. Our parents mentioned them only once or twice, usually in a vague way, commenting on how quiet they were. The basement apartment had its own entrance from the driveway, which ran along the side of the house. The driveway sloped downward toward the back, where the basement windows faced a small strip of pavement and then a fence. The entrance was half hidden, recessed into the concrete, always in shadow. Even during summer, that corner felt cool. One afternoon, my sister and I were coming home together. I do not remember where we had been. It was an ordinary day. The light was bright, the kind that makes everything look sharper. As we turned into the driveway, the city noise faded slightly, replaced by the familiar quiet of our building. That was when we heard footsteps. They were fast, uneven, slapping sounds against the concrete. Bare feet, running hard. The sound came from above us, from the direction of the street, and moved downhill toward the house. For a split second, I thought it was someone jogging. Then the sound grew louder, closer, frantic. Before either of us could react, she ran past us. The woman from the basement apartment came into view suddenly, filling the narrow space of the driveway. She was completely naked. There was no hesitation in her movement, no attempt to cover herself. Her body moved heavily as she ran, flesh shifting with each step. Her face was red, her expression blank but intense, focused on something we could not see ahead of her. I remember freezing. My brain could not process what my eyes were seeing. Nudity was not something I understood as shocking yet, but this was different. This was not accidental. This was not private. It was deliberate and exposed, placed directly in front of us without warning. She ran past us without looking at us. We were nothing to her. She continued down the driveway toward the street, which was only a few meters away. The street was busy, full of cars, cyclists, people walking. There was no barrier between the driveway and the sidewalk. She stopped at the edge of the street. She did not try to cross. She did not hide. She planted her feet and stood there, naked in full view of everything, hands on her hips, chest forward, head tilted back slightly. Her posture was rigid and proud, like she was presenting herself to the world. Cars slowed. I could hear horns, sudden brakes, voices rising in confusion. I did not see what happened next. My sister reacted instantly. She grabbed my arm, pulled me toward the front door, and unlocked it with shaking hands. We went inside and closed the door behind us. The sound of the city rushed back in through the walls, muffled but present. Inside the house, everything felt wrong. The familiar rooms looked different, as if the walls had shifted while we were gone. My heart was pounding. My skin felt tight. I remember feeling embarrassed, scared, confused, all at once, without having words for any of it. We did not talk about it. Not then, not later. The silence around the event made it heavier, like something we were not supposed to touch. The couple moved out not long after. I do not know the exact timeline. In memory, it feels sudden. One day their windows were covered, the dim light still appearing at night. Then the curtains were gone. The light stayed off. The basement entrance remained closed. Around that time, my parents were in the process of buying the house. It was a slow, stressful period full of paperwork and inspections. When the purchase was finalized, the house became ours in a way it had not been before. That included the basement apartment. We went down there for the first time after the couple left. I was older then, old enough to feel fear without needing an immediate reason. The basement door opened into a space that felt unfinished and hostile. The air was cold and stale, carrying a damp smell that clung to the back of my throat. The floor was bare concrete, darkened in patches, uneven underfoot. The walls were also concrete, painted once long ago but now chipped and stained. The ceiling was low, covered in white foam tiles that absorbed sound and light, making the room feel smaller than it was. The windows let in some daylight, but it was weak and gray, filtered through grime. Even with all the lights on, the space felt dim. Shadows gathered in the corners and refused to leave. What caught my attention immediately was the pit. It was rectangular, cut directly into the concrete floor. The edges were rough, not finished. It was deep enough to reach my knees. There was no cover, no railing, no clear purpose. It sat there in the middle of the main room, impossible to ignore. I stood at the edge and looked down. The bottom was bare concrete, darker than the surrounding floor. There were marks along the sides, scuffs and scratches, as if something had been dragged in and out. The pit was clean in a way that felt intentional, not scrubbed but used. No one explained it. My parents speculated quietly, but nothing they said felt convincing. Storage maybe, some unfinished work, a leftover from an earlier renovation. None of those explanations fit the shape, the depth, the placement. As we moved through the apartment, more details emerged that deepened the unease. The kitchen was small and poorly arranged, with cabinets that did not quite line up. The bathroom was narrow, with fixtures that looked older than the rest of the house. There were no signs of decoration, no nail holes in the walls, no marks where pictures might have hung. It was as if the people who lived there had tried not to leave any trace of themselves. The main room was empty, but it did not feel unused. The concrete floor had worn paths, areas where footsteps had passed over and over. The walls bore faint discolorations at certain heights, like something had leaned there repeatedly. The ceiling tiles above the pit were slightly darker, stained in a way that suggested moisture or heat. I could not stop thinking about the woman standing naked at the edge of the street, about her posture, about the way she had run past us without seeing us, about the man who lived with her, whom I barely remembered but whose presence lingered in the space. As a child, I had sensed something wrong without understanding it. Standing in that basement apartment, older and more aware, the feeling sharpened. It was not fear of a specific act or secret. It was the realization that people can build entire lives that operate just outside the edges of what others see, and that sometimes, by accident, a door opens. Over time, the basement was renovated. The pit was filled in. New flooring was laid. The walls were painted. The ceiling tiles were replaced. The apartment became bright and clean, transformed into a space that could be shown without discomfort. But even after the physical signs were gone, the memory remained fixed in my mind. The house never felt entirely neutral again. Certain corners carried weight. The driveway, especially, always made me uneasy. I avoided looking toward the basement windows at night. As an adult, I understand more about mental illness, about isolation, about how people can unravel quietly. I do not imagine elaborate crimes or hidden horrors. I do not need to. The reality is enough. Two people living withdrawn lives in a small basement, cut off from the world, existing in a way that slowly stripped away their sense of boundary until one of them broke through it in the most public way possible. The pit in the floor no longer feels like a mystery that needs a dramatic answer. It feels like a symbol of a life lived below the surface, carved out of concrete, cold and dark, functional but deeply wrong. The ending is not a shock or a revelation. It is the slow understanding that nothing supernatural happened there. Nothing impossible. Just people deteriorating out of sight, in a space that allowed it, until a moment came when it could no longer be contained. That knowledge sits heavier than any story I could invent. It is complete, closed, and grounded in the fact that the scariest things I have known did not announce themselves. They lived quietly beneath my feet, waiting for a moment when running barefoot into the daylight felt like the only option left. The house next door was a rental, and that mattered because people moved in and out often enough that I never learned to get attached. I had lived on that street long enough to notice patterns, though. Quiet families stayed a year or two, loud ones burned through the place fast. When the couple moved in, I noticed them right away, not because they introduced themselves or did anything neighborly, but because the noise started almost immediately. At first it blended into normal life sounds, raised voices through closed windows, doors shutting too hard, a car leaving late at night and returning an hour later. I told myself it was none of my business. I worked early mornings and spent evenings trying to unwind, and I learned to ignore most things that didn't touch my property line. That stopped working once the arguments became daily and predictable. Every afternoon, around the same time, the tension would rise. I could feel it before I heard it. The air would seem heavy, like before a storm. Then the shouting would start. It wasn't just volume, it was the tone. Sharp, frantic, endless. It would go on for hours without pause. No music, no television sounds, just two people locked in something that never resolved. I stopped sitting on my back porch. I kept my windows shut even on warm days. The woman scared me more than the man, though I never saw her directly do anything violent. There was something unstable about the rhythm of her movements when she stormed outside to smoke or pace the driveway. Her gestures were abrupt, her posture rigid, like she was always bracing for impact. The man looked exhausted all the time. His shoulders drooped. His eyes were sunken. He mowed his lawn with no shirt, moving slowly, stopping often, as if the simple act drained him. Weeks passed. The arguments didn't cool down, they escalated. Objects started breaking. I would hear crashes that sounded like furniture tipping or cabinets slamming hard enough to split wood. One evening, a glass bottle shattered against their fence. Another time, something heavy struck the side of their house with a dull thud that carried through the ground. I stopped leaving my car parked on the street and started pulling it into the driveway, just in case. Sleep became difficult. I would wake up in the early hours to the sound of movement next door, footsteps pacing back and forth. Sometimes the shouting continued late into the night. Other times it was silent, which was worse. Silence meant something had shifted. I would lie in bed listening for any sign that things were contained. My body stayed tense, waiting. The divorce came suddenly, at least on the surface. One week they were still screaming at each other, and the next there was a moving truck. The woman left first. Her car was packed tight, trash bags taped shut, and stuffed into every available space. She didn't look at anyone as she drove away. The man stayed a few more days, sleeping in the house alone. The yard grew wild fast. The lights stayed off. Then he was gone too. I felt relief I hadn't expected. The street felt lighter. The quiet returned, and it felt earned. I started opening my windows again. I sat outside in the evenings. The rental stayed empty for a while, and I assumed that chapter was closed. I was wrong. I learned he had moved one block up the road, when the police cars started showing up there instead. At first it was just rumors drifting down through neighbors, who talked more than I did. Complaints, noise, late-night disturbances. Then I saw him myself one afternoon while walking to get the mail. He stood in his new driveway, staring at the street, arms crossed, jaw tight. He looked thinner. His hair was uneven, like he had cut it himself. Over the next few weeks, the tension followed him. It felt like a stain that spread. People started staying indoors again. Kids stopped riding bikes past his place. I noticed curtains closing when he stepped outside. He paced the sidewalk in front of his house the same way he had paced his old driveway, walking back and forth without destination, stopping only to stare at nothing in particular. The day it came to a head was clear and still. No wind. No traffic noise. I remember that because sound carried too well. I was inside when I first noticed something was wrong. A strange stillness settled over the block, the kind that doesn't feel peaceful. I stepped onto my porch and saw him a block away, walking slowly down the street. He had a handgun in his right hand. He wasn't waving it or pointing it at anyone. That almost made it worse. He held it low, casual, like it belonged there. He walked with purpose but no urgency, eyes fixed ahead. My chest tightened so fast it felt like a punch. I backed inside and locked my door without thinking. I turned off the lights and stood near the window, watching through a narrow gap in the blinds. Police sirens grew louder in the distance. Someone had already called. He disappeared back toward his house before the first car arrived. The officers blocked off the street and took positions behind their doors. I watched from my front room, heart pounding, hands shaking. Every sound felt amplified. A dog barking several houses away, a car door slamming. A helicopter began circling overhead, low and steady. He barricaded himself inside his house. That word spread quickly. Barricaded. It carried weight. It meant this was no longer just a disturbance. It meant time stretched out and danger lingered. I stayed inside, phone in hand, refreshing news pages, though there was nothing yet. The street was sealed off. No one moved. Hours passed slowly. I sat on the floor at one point because standing made my legs weak. I imagined worst-case scenarios without wanting to. I pictured him at a window. I pictured shots fired. I pictured police rushing the house. Each image felt real enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. The helicopter never left. Its steady rotation marked time better than any clock. Police vehicles multiplied. Tactical units arrived. I could see them from my window, moving carefully, methodical, trained. The house sat quiet, blinds drawn, no movement visible. The quiet pressed in hard. Eventually it ended without noise. No gunshots. No sudden chaos. Just a slow shift as officers relaxed their stances. The helicopter lifted away. Ambulances that had waited down the block drove off unused. The man was let out in handcuffs. He looked smaller than I remembered. Hollow. He didn't resist. He didn't look around. His face held no expression I could read. Later, it came out that he had been alone the entire time. No hostages. No one else inside. He had threatened to shoot someone who wasn't there. The realization unsettled me more than if there had been another person. It meant his anger had nowhere to go but inward, and that made it unpredictable. After that day, the street never felt the same. Even once the police tape was gone and traffic returned, a sense of caution lingered. I caught myself scanning more, listening harder. The rental next door stayed empty longer than usual. When someone new finally moved in, I watched them carefully, hoping for quiet. I still think about how close the danger had been, how easily it slid into ordinary life. There were no warning sirens at the beginning, no dramatic turning point. Just months of pressure, building unnoticed until it broke into the open. The fear wasn't in the moment he held the gun. It was in realizing how long I had lived beside something unstable, mistaking it for noise, until it nearly spilled onto the street where I stood. I rented the upstairs of that house in my late 20s, when my life was quiet and narrow, and I thought that was a good thing. The place sat back from the road, half hidden by overgrown hedges and old fruit trees that had long since stopped being productive. The weatherboards were thick and uneven, painted a tired cream that never quite dried after rain. The house had weight to it. Not the kind you can measure, but the kind you feel when you walk up the steps and the wood answers back under your feet. My landlord lived downstairs. He had been born in that house. His grandfather built it. His father died there. His grandfather died there too. That alone made the place feel older than it looked. In New Zealand, a house with that much history stands out. Most places get renovated until nothing remains of the original structure. This one resisted that. The doors were narrow. The ceilings were high. The windows rattled even when there was no wind. He was in his 60s when I knew him. Lean, wary, with hands that never seemed still even when his body was. He moved with intention, not speed. His wife lived with him. She was gentle, quiet, always busy with small tasks that kept the house running. They had no children. The first thing I noticed about him was the basement. It was not a cellar in the way people imagine. It was a space dug out over decades, reinforced, dry, lit by bare bulbs. The shelves held objects that did not belong together except by the fact that he had found them. Carved wood, bone, stone, tools shaped by hands that no longer existed. Some pieces sat wrapped in cloth. Others were just there, exposed, treated like everyday items. He did not label anything. He did not lock anything away. The value of what he had was impossible to grasp at the time. Even then, in the 1990s, it was clear that some of those things were worth more than houses. Entire museums would have been built around them. He did not behave like a collector. There was no pride in ownership. The objects were not trophies. They were evidence. Proof that the past was close enough to touch if you knew where to reach. He stayed up late. Every night. The television glowed downstairs until 3 or 4 in the morning. I learned his schedule because insomnia was part of my life then. When the house was silent except for the distant sound of the TV, I knew he was awake. He watched the same shows on repeat. He never sat. He knelt on a small towel on the floor. The towel was stained and threadbare, folded just enough to keep his knees off the bare boards. Chairs were nearby. He never used them. When I could not sleep, I would go downstairs and sit nearby while he watched. I did not speak much. He did not expect conversation. The presence of another person seemed enough. The house felt different at that hour. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. The light from the television threw moving shadows across the shelves and door frames. His posture never changed. Knees down, back straight, eyes fixed on the screen. He had lived a life that made ordinary people sound small by comparison, though he never framed it that way. He worked on pest eradication projects across remote islands, helping restore bird populations that had been pushed to the edge. His closest friend was responsible for saving a species most people had already accepted was doomed. I met that friend several times without knowing who he was. A quiet man, reserved, almost blunt. Years later, after reading a book, I realized I had shared tea with someone whose work would be remembered long after most names faded. Every Friday I paid the rent in person. That was his rule. It was never a transaction. His wife would have food ready. I would sit at the kitchen table, the same one his grandfather had eaten at, and the week would quietly close. If I traveled, the rent dropped. If I was away longer, it dropped further. If it was my birthday or Christmas, the rent vanished entirely. Sometimes money appeared in my hand afterward, given casually, as if it meant nothing. What unsettled me was how often he knew things without being told. He knew when I was planning to leave town before I mentioned it. He knew when something of mine was missing and would point to where it had been left. Not in a clever way. Not as a guess. It was as if the house told him. His ability to find artifacts defied explanation without becoming unbelievable. He would walk into a landscape that experts had exhausted with tools and time, and he would stop in one place. He would wade into water or sand or mud, guided by nothing visible, and within minutes he would pull something free. Objects that changed academic understanding. Items that filled gaps that researchers had accepted would never be closed. The basement held pieces that museums could not accept, because they were too valuable. The bureaucracy alone defeated them. Duties exceeded budgets. The irony was never lost on me. Priceless history sitting beneath a house that creaked in the wind, unseen by anyone who mattered on paper. There were other things stored there too. A preserved bird kept legally under old permits. A lump of ambergris the size of a paving stone, pale and waxy, smelling faintly of the ocean even years after being found. Everything had a story attached to it, though he rarely told them in full. One afternoon he decided his wife needed to learn to drive. There was no discussion. She did not resist. He taught her patiently. She passed her test. A few days later, a new car appeared in the driveway, small and modern, beside the immaculate old station wagon he maintained like a relic. He seemed satisfied after that. Calmer? Then, without warning, he was gone. He had been helping someone with basic repairs. Nothing strenuous. He mentioned feeling tired, sat down, and died. No struggle, no delay. His heart stopped. That was the explanation. Simple and final. The shock settled slowly. The house felt altered immediately. Not haunted. Empty in a different way. His wife moved through the rooms with care, as if every object required permission. The television stayed off at night. The basement door remained closed. What disturbed me most was the sequence of events leading up to his death. The timing was too clean. He had ensured his wife could drive. He had ensured she had a car. He had reduced loose ends. It was as if he had read ahead to the final page and prepared accordingly. After the funeral, practical matters followed. Lawyers visited. Museum representatives returned. The collection became a problem to solve rather than a wonder to witness. I moved out not long after. The house felt wrong without him. Not dangerous. Just incomplete. Years later, I still think about that basement. About the way he found what others could not. About how he seemed tuned to patterns no one else noticed. I do not believe he could predict the future. I believe he understood his own body, his own limits, and the rhythms of the life he had built. He recognized when it was time to stop. The horror of that house was not in anything hidden or unnatural. It was in realizing how little control most people have over their lives, and how rare it is to meet someone who knows exactly where they stand in the world, right up until the moment they step out of it. I moved into that place because it was cheap and close to work. A narrow government-built house with thin walls and a small strip of grass out front that never grew properly. The houses were packed close together, identical shapes softened by years of weather and neglect. You could hear everything if you paid attention. Doors coughing. Televisions left on all night. It was the kind of street where people learned each other's routines without ever speaking. The woman next door had already been there longer than I had. I learned that early, mostly because the neighbors across the road talked about her in careful voices, the way people talk when they want to sound kind, but also want to be heard. She was around 50, maybe a little older. Her hair was usually pulled back and uneven, as if she cut it herself and never quite finished. Her clothes never matched the weather. Some days she wore heavy coats in summer. Other days she wore thin shirts in the cold. She carried a bag that looked older than she was, the strap mended with tape and string. She did not like the house she lived in. That much became obvious fast. During the day she was rarely home. She would leave early and walk toward the bus stop, then disappear into the city. People said she begged. I never saw her doing it myself, but I saw her return late in the afternoon, tired, shoulders hunched, eyes flat. At night she became loud. Not constant noise, not something you could predict. It came in bursts, crashing sounds, shouting that rose and fell without pattern. Sometimes it lasted minutes, sometimes hours. Sometimes it stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving the house silent again, as if nothing had happened. Her voice changed when she yelled. That was the strangest part. Some nights she sounded local, harsh and clipped. Other nights her voice shifted into something else, rounded vowels, slower rhythm. It took me a while to place it. French? Or something close enough that my brain labeled it that way. The accent never mixed. It was one or the other, as if two separate people lived inside her and took turns speaking. I never complained. Most people on that street had something going on. Complaints felt pointless. I learned to sleep through noise, learned which sounds mattered and which didn't. Sirens passed often. Sometimes they stopped. Sometimes they didn't. You could tell who was new by how they reacted. I was not new for long. The day everything happened was ordinary. Work had been slow. The sky stayed gray all afternoon, that flat light that makes everything look tired. I came home later than usual, parked out front, and noticed her immediately. She was pacing along the footpath, moving back and forth in short, tight lines. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't crying. Her hands kept opening and closing, as if she couldn't decide what to do with them. I felt that pull people get when something feels wrong, but still close enough to be their business. I had lived next to her long enough that ignoring her felt worse than checking. I asked what was going on, expecting either nothing or too much. She told me she was locked out. The words came fast, sharp, wrapped in that French accent. She said she needed to get inside. She said I had to help. She wanted tools. She wanted force. She wanted the door open now. She kept pointing at the house as if it had betrayed her. I didn't have tools. I never did. I told her that. I said I could call someone who did. A locksmith made sense to me. It felt practical. She reacted badly. Her mood flipped in a second. She said she didn't need a locksmith. She said she needed the police. She said it like the idea itself offended her. I didn't understand how police would help with a locked door, but she was focused on it. She was sure of it. She needed them, now not later. I handed her my phone because it felt easier than arguing. She took it without thanks, without hesitation, already pacing again while dialing. I stood there, unsure whether to stay close or step back. The call escalated fast. Her voice sharpened. Her accent thickened. Her body tightened like a wire pulled too far. I couldn't hear the other side of the call, but I could hear enough to know it wasn't going well. When she threw my phone, it wasn't dramatic. It was pure frustration. A sharp downward motion, no warning. The phone hit the concrete and bounced once before landing face down. She shouted at no one in particular, words piling over each other, then went back to pacing as if the phone had never existed. I picked it up. The screen was cracked but still working. I slid it into my pocket and stayed where I was. Leaving felt wrong. Staying felt dangerous in a quiet way. She was still talking, but now it wasn't aimed at anyone. She told me about her life. The stories came in pieces, not ordered, but heavy with repetition. She had been orphaned young. She had grown up in places where people watched you sleep. She moved between institutions, between rules, between rooms that never felt like hers. While she talked about those places, her accent vanished. Her voice turned unmistakably Australian, flat and rough, as if it had been buried and finally pushed its way back out. She talked about her body next. About pain. About damage. About how things inside her never healed right. She said she had 7 hernias. She said it like it was a badge, like proof that she had endured something others couldn't see. She lifted her shirt to show me. I told her I didn't need to see. She didn't listen. Her stomach was marked and uneven, skin stretched in ways that looked wrong. I looked away and focused on the street instead, the cracks in the pavement, the quiet houses, the way no one else had come outside. She asked again for a crowbar. She needed leverage. She needed force. She needed someone to take responsibility. I told her again that I didn't have tools. Her reaction was immediate. She screamed, not at me exactly, but close enough that it felt aimed. She said I should call the police myself. She said they would listen to me. She said it was different when someone like me spoke. I called the non-emergency number because that seemed like the least extreme option. I gave the address. I gave her name. The woman on the other end sighed in a way that cut through everything. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't hidden. It was tired and familiar. I understood then that this situation had happened before. More than once. Enough times that it had become routine. Things moved fast after that. 2 squad cars arrived. An ambulance followed. Lights flashed against the houses, blue and red washing over walls that had seen it all before. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. Doors stayed closed. The street felt suddenly small, boxed in by attention. My neighbor explained herself again, her French accent back in full force. She said she needed a crowbar. She said that was all. She said everything would be fine once the door was open. Her request was refused. She didn't fight. She didn't collapse. She argued until the energy ran out of her voice. Then she let them take her. I stood there until they left, until the street returned to normal, until the quiet felt heavier than the noise had. I went inside and locked my door. I sat on my couch and stared at the wall, listening to the absence next door. No smashing. No yelling. Just empty space. She came back days later. Nothing was said about it. The pattern continued. Daytime absence. Nighttime noise. The accents kept shifting. I learned to recognize the sound of her steps. I learned when to expect the crashes. I learned when it was safe to sleep. Months passed. Life moved on. I went to a party one night, far from that street, surrounded by people who didn't know where I lived or who lived next to me. I mentioned my neighbor in passing, the locked-out incident, the strange details that stuck with me. Someone laughed and asked if I meant the woman with the 7 hernias. The room went quiet for a second. I said yes. He nodded like that confirmed something. He said his wife worked at a bottle shop. He said my neighbor came in often. He said she had a routine. She would approach the glass, lift her shirt, press her stomach against it. The sight distracted staff. While eyes were pulled toward her, someone else took bottles. Port, usually. Cheap and strong. The thefts were simple, effective. I felt sick hearing it. Not because of the crime, but because of how exposed it made her seem. Her body used as a tool. Her pain turned into currency. Her presence reduced to a tactic. I moved out of that house not long after. Not because of her, not exactly. Life shifted. Work changed. I needed something different. But I still see her sometimes. Always in the city. Always in the same spot. Sitting or standing, bag at her feet, eyes scanning faces that pass without stopping. She looks smaller now. Or maybe I just see her more clearly. The house is gone from her story. The noise is gone. The accents still surface when she talks to herself, slipping in and out like old habits that never fully fade. I think about that night often. About the locked door. About the crowbar she never got. About the way everyone knew her name before I did. There was nothing supernatural about her. Nothing hidden. The horror was in how ordinary it all was. How easily she fit into systems designed to hold people without ever helping them. How familiar her suffering was to everyone except the people forced to see it up close. I didn't save her. I didn't fix anything. I stood there, made calls, handed over a phone, and went back inside my house. That is the part that stays with me. The knowledge that I did what I could, and that what I could do was never enough. I lived in a narrow row of duplexes that shared a gravel alley running behind them. Trash cans, utility poles, oil stains that never faded. Sound carried there in a strange way. You could hear a cough from half a block down. You could hear doors open and close even when you were not looking for them. Across that alley was his place. A single-story unit with a detached garage that faced the gravel. The main garage door stayed shut at all times. The smaller side door was almost always open. That was how I knew when he was in there. He was in there most evenings. 5 o'clock on the dot, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but always until deep into the night. The glow from a single bulb spilled out onto the gravel. Cigarette smoke leaked through the doorway and hung low in the air, heavy and stale. He never played music. He never used power tools. He never worked on a car. He just stayed inside that garage, seated, awake, present. I learned early on that he was retired military. That came from the landlord, not from him. He did not talk about his service in a way that lined up with any clear timeline. He had no job, no visitors, no family that I ever saw. His house lights were usually off. The garage was where he lived his evenings. That became normal to me faster than it should have. I would walk over sometimes after a few beers. Not every night, just enough that it felt casual. The alley was quiet then. Most people were inside eating dinner, watching television, winding down. I crossed the gravel and stepped into the edge of that light, leaning against the door frame, breathing in smoke and oil and old wood. Inside, the garage was sparse. A folding chair, a dented metal table, a coffee maker that never moved. The smell of burnt coffee was constant, sharp and bitter. Empty mugs lined the table like markers. Ashtrays were everywhere, overflowing but never spilled. Everything had a place. Nothing changed. He was calm in a way that made the space feel heavier. He drank black coffee late into the night, cup after cup, as if sleep were something he refused on principle. He smoked constantly, one cigarette bleeding into the next. His eyes were alert but not restless. He watched me when I was there, not aggressively, not suspiciously, just focused. Over time, I understood that he talked to fill the hours, not to connect. His stories came out in long, uninterrupted streams. There was no back and forth, no rhythm of conversation, just a steady flow of details delivered with precision and certainty. The more I listened, the more I realized that he did not expect belief or disbelief. He expected attention. The first story that stuck with me was about something he claimed to have seen while deployed. Not a firefight, not an ambush, not anything that would fit the usual pattern of military exaggeration. He described an animal that should not have existed. A massive, armored thing with a heavy tail, seen briefly and clearly, moving through terrain where it did not belong. He provided specifics: size, movement, color. He spoke as if recalling a routine sighting, not a revelation. When I challenged the logic of it later, he did not react. He simply repeated the facts as he understood them, unchanged, unbothered. That pattern never shifted. No matter how much time passed, no matter how often I pushed back internally, his version of events stayed fixed. He did not escalate. He did not embellish. He did not adjust his story to my reactions. That consistency was what unsettled me most. Other stories followed. He spoke about hidden structures of power operating alongside normal society. Not governments in the usual sense, but parallel systems with their own rules and hierarchies. He described groups that moved through the world unnoticed, influencing events quietly. He assigned them motives that were cold and strategic. He described internal disputes, long-term plans, failures, corrections. Everything was framed like a briefing. As time went on, the focus narrowed. He returned to one idea repeatedly. A specific group he believed existed, organized, widespread, and deliberate. He spoke about them as if they were a known variable, something you planned around rather than questioned. He described subgroups, factions, internal politics. He described a smaller offshoot that, according to him, had developed methods of moving through time. He framed it as technology, not magic. He treated it like an arms race problem, not a myth. The stories were detailed enough to feel rehearsed, but they were not theatrical. There was no excitement in his delivery. No fear, no wonder, just certainty. I told myself he was lonely. I told myself he needed an audience. I told myself that this was harmless, that people believe strange things all the time. That belief alone does not make someone dangerous. I kept coming back because part of me was curious, and part of me felt responsible. Leaving him alone in that garage night after night felt like abandoning something fragile. There were signs I ignored because they did not fit the story I wanted. He never slept when the garage light was on. I would wake up at 3 in the morning to use the bathroom and see that door still open, smoke still drifting. His car never moved. He tracked the routines of people in the alley without comment, noticing who came home late, who left early, who changed patterns. He remembered details I forgot mentioning. One night, I noticed a notebook on the table, thick, filled edge to edge, diagrams, arrows, lists, dates, names I did not recognize, places circled and underlined. The handwriting was tight and controlled, not frantic, not messy, methodical. I did not touch it. I did not ask about it. The shift happened slowly enough that I almost missed it. His stories began to reference the alley more often. Not directly at first. Just as an example of how unnoticed places worked. How transitional spaces were ideal for observation. How people assumed safety and familiarity. He spoke about women more than he had before, but not in a sexual way, in a logistical way, as population variables, as resources, I stopped drinking when I went over. I started keeping my hands in my pockets. I started standing closer to the door. The garage felt smaller. The air felt thicker. The light seemed harsher. The night I stopped going over was quiet. Too quiet, no smoke, no light. The garage door was shut completely. I felt relief before I felt concern. The next evening it was still shut. The one after that too. Days passed, then a week. A police cruiser showed up one afternoon. Then another. The landlord stood in the alley with his arms crossed, face pale. An ambulance came but did not leave in a hurry. I learned later in fragments. He had been reported by a woman in a nearby neighborhood who noticed him following her repeatedly, writing things down, asking questions that did not make sense. When police searched his house and garage, they found notebooks stacked in boxes. Hundreds of pages, maps with routes highlighted, schedules, photos taken from a distance. The stories he told me were all there, written as operational theory, not fantasy. He believed them completely. He had been planning around them. There was no evidence that he had harmed anyone. That mattered. It kept the story quiet. He was taken in for evaluation. The garage was emptied. The light never came back on. The alley feels wider now. Sound carries differently. Sometimes I smell burnt coffee when there is none. I think about how close belief can sit next to action without crossing the line until it does. I think about how calm certainty can hide risk better than rage ever could. I do not cross the alley at night anymore. I do not linger in shared spaces. I understand now that nothing supernatural ever needed to be true for something to be deeply wrong. We bought that house young enough to still feel like ownership was temporary, like the place could reject us if we didn't behave right. It sat on a quiet street with short driveways and backyards that almost touched. The kind of neighborhood where people watched out for each other without admitting it. Lawns cut on Saturdays. Trash cans rolled back in by whoever noticed them first. Kids rode bikes in loose packs until the streetlights came on. The couple next door stood out from the start, not because they were strange, but because they seemed settled in a way we weren't yet. They were maybe 10 years older than us, old enough to feel steady, young enough to still belong. The wife made an impression immediately. She had a calm face, the kind that looked attentive even when relaxed. She learned our names in the first week and remembered details without effort. She asked how the move had gone, whether the kids were sleeping, whether we had found a good grocery store. She never pried, never rushed, never filled silence. She felt safe. She walked a lot. Morning and evening, steady loops around the block, sometimes longer routes through nearby streets. When school started, she stood near the bus stop with the other parents even though her own kids were older. She didn't hover. She didn't insert herself. She simply stood there, hands folded or tucked into her jacket pockets, watching the street. The effect was subtle but real. Parents relaxed a little. Kids lingered a little longer before boarding. When the bus pulled away, she stayed until it disappeared, then walked home. I noticed that when she was outside, people behaved better. Cars slowed. Teenagers lowered their voices. Strangers crossing the neighborhood adjusted their posture. It wasn't authority. It was presence. You felt seen, not judged. Her husband was different in every way that mattered. I rarely saw him. Weeks could pass without a glimpse. When I did catch sight of him, it was usually late, a figure slipping out of the house under the porch light, or early, headlights sweeping across our bedroom wall before dawn. He worked strange hours. She said he was a CPA with demanding clients, all local. That detail stuck with me, because it didn't match the schedule. He came home around 1 in the morning and left again by 5. Sometimes he didn't come home at all for days. She said it was audits, deadlines, emergencies. She said it calmly, without frustration, as if reciting weather patterns. The house itself felt lived in but restrained. Curtains always drawn at night. Garage door closed even during the day. The yard kept neat but undecorated. No wind chimes, no flags, no personal markers. Inside lights followed no pattern I could identify. Some nights the place went dark early. Other nights a single room glowed until morning. They had one kid still at home, a high school boy. He seemed normal in the way teenagers often do when observed briefly. Polite, quiet, eyes down. He waved back if you waved first. He didn't linger outside. He didn't have friends over. I never saw him with headphones or a phone in his hand. He moved through the world like someone passing through a hallway. They also had 2 daughters who were mostly absent. She mentioned them casually, never with bitterness. They had left as soon as they could. They were busy, independent, making their own lives. She framed it as success, though something about the phrasing felt practiced, like she had rehearsed how to make it sound positive. Life went on. Seasons changed. The wife remained a constant. She checked on us when storms came through. She brought over baked goods at holidays. She remembered birthdays without Facebook prompts. She listened more than she spoke. When my wife had a rough week, she noticed without being told. When our kids struggled at school, she offered practical advice without stepping over lines. She never gave opinions about her own marriage unless asked, and even then, only in outlines. The husband remained a shadow. When I did see him, it was brief and unremarkable. Medium height, average build, clean clothes. No visible tics. He didn't avoid eye contact, but he didn't hold it either. He nodded once, said nothing, kept moving. There was nothing overt to latch onto, which made the absence feel heavier. The first real crack came one summer night when my wife and the neighbor sat on our back porch. I was inside with the kids, windows open, the low sound of their voices drifting in. It was one of those nights that stretch on without effort. Warm air, insects humming, the smell of cut grass still lingering. They sat out there for hours. I didn't listen. I wasn't curious. The tone was relaxed, familiar. When my wife came inside later, her face looked different. Not shocked, not frightened, flattened. Like she had absorbed something heavy and was still adjusting to the weight. She didn't tell me right away. When she did, it came out in pieces, each one placed carefully, as if accuracy mattered more than comfort. The neighbor had shared something about her marriage. Not a complaint, not an accusation, an explanation. Her husband liked her to lie perfectly still in bed, not asleep. Aware, motionless. He would stand or sit there and stare at her body. He would touch her chest with his hands. Slowly, methodically, he would do this for hours. 2 hours at a time. She would remain still until it ended. There was no description of sex, no climax, no affection, just endurance. She described it as a preference, a need. Something she accommodated because it was easier than resisting. Because resisting led to consequences she didn't define. My wife told me this without embellishment. She used the neighbor's calm language. She didn't speculate. She didn't label it. She let the silence do the work. I lay awake that night replaying everything I knew about the couple. The hours. The absence. The daughters who fled. The son who stayed quiet. The wife's constant presence outside, watching other people's children. The husband's sealed routines. The way their house seemed to close itself off from the street. Nothing illegal presented itself. Nothing provable. Nothing actionable. Just a shape forming around empty space. After that, I noticed more. The wife's walks followed the same paths. She never varied them. She never skipped them. Even in bad weather, she adjusted but did not stop. The bus stop ritual continued long after our kids aged out. She knew every child's name without being introduced. She knew which ones ran, which ones dragged their feet, which ones needed reminders. She corrected behavior gently, without authority, and it worked. I noticed that she never invited anyone into her house. She visited, she brought food, she hosted nothing. When people did step inside, it was brief and purposeful. Pickups, drop-offs, never lingering. The husband's car changed once. Same model, same color, new plates. The old one disappeared without comment. I noticed because I tracked patterns now. I hated that about myself, but I couldn't stop. There were nights when he came home and did not leave again before morning. On those mornings, the wife still walked, still stood at the bus stop, still waved. But there was a tension in her shoulders, a stiffness that eased only after she returned home. I thought about the daughters often. I wondered how early they had left. I wondered what they told friends about their childhood. I wondered whether they stayed in touch with their brother. I wondered whether the wife missed them or simply accepted their absence as part of the structure she lived within. Time passed. We lived our lives. Jobs changed. Kids grew. The neighbors remained fixed points. The wife aged gently, as if stress had learned to avoid her. The husband seemed unchanged, though that might have been because I still rarely saw him. Then one winter, police cars appeared on the street in the early morning. Not rushing, no sirens, just presence. 2 vehicles parked near the corner. Officers standing by their doors, speaking quietly. The wife was not outside. The house was dark. I watched from our window, heart steady but alert. Nothing happened for a long time. Then one officer walked to the neighbor's door and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Harder. Eventually, the door opened. The husband stepped out. He wore a coat. His posture was neutral. He listened. He nodded. He stepped back inside. The officers followed. They were inside for less than an hour. When they came out, they carried nothing. No boxes. No bags. No handcuffs. The husband remained inside. The wife emerged briefly to speak with one of the officers. Her face was composed. She nodded once. She went back inside. The cars left. Later that day, the wife walked. She stood at the bus stop. Nothing changed. I never learned what that visit was about. No rumors circulated. No follow-up occurred. Life resumed. Years went by. We eventually moved. Better school district, longer commute, new routines. The neighbor couple stayed. We exchanged cards at holidays. The wife sent handwritten notes. We stayed connected on social media in the shallow way adults do when time pulls them apart. Likes, comments, polite check-ins. My wife met her for lunch once a year or so when schedules aligned. Always the same restaurant. Always daytime. Always brief. The wife never complained. Never hinted. Never asked for help. She talked about books. About walks. About other people's children. She asked about ours. 15 years passed. Looking back now with distance and context, the story feels clearer than it did while living inside it. At the time, it felt like standing in fog, sensing shapes without edges. Now, the outline is sharper. I believe the husband lived a divided life. Not necessarily a second family, though that possibility fits the hours. More likely a private world structured around control, ritual, and concealment. The wife's role was containment. She absorbed the pressure, redirected the focus, watched the world so others wouldn't have to notice what lived beside them. Her vigilance wasn't accidental. It wasn't kindness alone. It was mitigation. She stood at the bus stop because she trusted herself more than him. She walked predictable routes so she could monitor space without being questioned. She kept her home closed so nothing leaked out. She shared just enough with my wife to release some of the weight, then returned to her position. The daughters left because they could. The son stayed because someone had to. The wife remained because leaving would have meant exposure, disruption, risk she was not willing to unleash. Nothing dramatic ever happened. No bodies, no headlines, no closure. That is what makes it unsettling. The threat was managed, not removed. The danger was absorbed, not confronted. The neighborhood stayed safe because one person took responsibility for maintaining that balance at personal cost. We still exchange cards. We still see her updates online. She looks older now, tired but intact. Her husband appears in none of the photos. I don't know if he was a killer. I don't know if he ever crossed lines that would have forced intervention. I do know that the marriage functioned like a containment vessel, and she was the seal. When I think back to that street, I don't remember fear. I remember calm. I remember children playing. I remember feeling protected without knowing why. That is what troubles me most.